In 1807, following his defeat of the Russian army at Friedland, Napoleon had travelled to Tilsit to meet the Russian Emperor Alexander. During their celebrated encounter, the two emperors formed a friendship and made an alliance. But it was not to last. Over the next 5 years, relations between France and Russia cooled dramatically. The Russians were irritated by Napoleon's creation of a Duchy of Warsaw in Poland, which they regarded as meddling in their own front yard. They feared it would lead to the return of a fully fledged Polish state, a traditional thorn in Russia's side. Then there was Napoleon's offer to marry Alexander's sister, Grand Duchess Anna Pavlovna, to cement their alliance. But the Romanovs hated the idea, and after a year of Russian prevarication, Napoleon married Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor, instead. Later that year, Napoleon broke a guarantee made at Tilsit and annexed the Duchy of Oldenburg, ruled by Alexander's sister's father-in-law. Worst of all was the fallout over the continental system, Napoleon's not very effective economic blockade against Britain, designed to cripple his most steadfast enemy. Alexander had agreed to join the continental system at Tilsit, but it was hugely unpopular in Russia and ruinous to her finances during a period of economic crisis. When Napoleon found out that Russia was flouting the rules of the system and had resumed an illicit trade with Britain, he was furious. With both emperors accusing the other of bad faith, their two countries began preparing for war. This video is sponsored by Cinder Block Publishing and the new historical fiction novel Terribilita by Ben Wyckoff Shore. It tells the dramatic story of a family caught in the turbulent tides of 19th century Italian history. The patriarch, a hero of the Italian Risorgimento, who served with Garibaldi. His son, whose act of political defiance brings disaster crashing down on his family. A grandson who seeks refuge and anonymity amid the last great age of sail. This fast-paced story is crammed with great historical characters and events, from Italy's brutal and forgotten empire building in East Africa to the devastating Battle of Solferino, where Napoleon III tried to recapture his uncle's glory with his own Italian campaign that ended in slaughter. The bloodshed so shocked a young Swiss observer, Henri Dunant, one of many historical figures that we meet in the novel, that he went on to found the International Committee for the Red Cross. This new novel is a perfect read for any history fan and has been getting great reviews. Terribilita is available now in paperback, ebook and audiobook. Thank you to Terribilita and Cinder Block Publishing for sponsoring this video. Napoleon knew an invasion of Russia was a massive undertaking, especially as he still had an unfinished war in Spain that was tying down more than 200,000 troops. Nevertheless, in 1811 he began to assemble the largest army Europe had ever seen, around 600,000 men, though less than half of them were French. The rest came from allied states across Europe. There was a Polish corps from the Duchy of Warsaw, led by Prince Poniatowski, a corps from each of the German kingdoms of Saxony, Westphalia and Bavaria, from the Kingdom of Italy, as well as Swiss, Dutch, Croat, Spanish and Portuguese units scattered throughout the army. There were even contingents from Prussia and Austria, France's recent enemies, now uneasy allies. Some of these allied troops, such as the Poles and Germans, were as reliable as their French counterparts. Others were very inexperienced, or, like the Prussians and Austrians, reluctant to be there at all. This gigantic formation was deployed in 3 armies: the main force under Napoleon himself, another led by his stepson Eugene, and a third led by his younger brother Jerome, King of Westphalia. Neither of these two were experienced commanders, Though one would distinguish himself on campaign, the other would not. On their left flank, Marshal MacDonald led 10th Corps with a large Prussian contingent, while the right flank was guarded by General Schwarzenberg's Austrian Corps. Another 100,000 troops were in reserve, including Marshal Victor's 9th Corps. Initially, the Russians only had 220,000 men to face this juggernaut, organized into Barclay de Tolly's First Army, Prince Bagration's Second Army, and General Tomasov's Third Army. They would be outnumbered 2-1. But in the run-up to war, Russia scored two crucial diplomatic triumphs. Sweden had been at war with Russia just 3 years earlier, a conflict which cost her Finland. By a curious turn of events, Sweden was now ruled by Napoleon's ex-marshal Bernadotte. But after Napoleon occupied Swedish Pomerania without warning, a furious Bernadotte promised Russia that Sweden would remain neutral. Meanwhile, a peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire ended Russia's 6-year war against its southern rival. These two agreements secured Russia's flanks from any strategic threat, and freed up troops to face Napoleon's invasion. On the 24th of June 1812, French troops began crossing the Niemen River into Russian territory. The army was so large, the crossing took 5 days. Napoleon's plan was to attack north of the impassable Pripet marshes and defeat Barclay's army, while Jérôme pinned Bagration in place. French forces would then swing south to trap Bagration. Napoleon expected the campaign to be over in 5 weeks. But the sheer size of the French army convinced the cautious Barclay that retreat was his only option. Prince Bagration, a much more aggressive commander by instinct, and often Barclay's fierce critic, was forced to agree. As they withdrew, they burned villages and crops, part of a scorched earth strategy to deny supplies to the enemy. In 4 days, Napoleon had reached Vilnius, but Barclay was gone. To the south, Jérôme failed to pin down Bagration. So when Davout's First Corps swung southeast to trap him, he'd already withdrawn to safety. Napoleon's younger brother was out of his depth. Stung by the Emperor's criticism, humiliated when his troops were put under Marshal Davout's command, he resigned his post and returned to Westphalia. The campaign was already beginning to expose serious flaws in Napoleon's plan. Knowing his troops would struggle to live off the land in this impoverished region, he'd organized huge supply depots and transport units to feed the army. But wagons rolled slowly along Russia's bad roads, which were turned to rivers of mud by summer thunderstorms. The army had to make frequent stops to allow its supplies to catch up. Bad news for Napoleon's plan to catch the Russians, but a much-needed relief for the many thousands of young conscripts in his army, not used to hard marches day after day. Many were soon dropping out with exhaustion. Others deserted. There were also huge problems of command and control over a vast multinational army that was 3 times bigger than any Napoleon had commanded before. La Grande Armée, once famed for its speed of maneuver, had become a lumbering beast. After a pause to rest and regroup at Vilnius, Napoleon resumed his advance. Barclay continued his retreat to Vitebsk, where he hoped Bagration's Second Army would be able to join him. But Davout blocked Bagration's path at Sultanovka, forcing him to make for Smolensk instead. At Vitebsk, Napoleon clashed with Barclay's rearguard, but once more the Russians escaped, after setting fire to all the stores they couldn't take with them. Meanwhile, 300 miles away, on Napoleon's southern flank, Russian Third Army attacked and defeated the Saxon 7th Corps, forcing Napoleon to divert Schwarzenberg's Austrian Corps to their aid. By the end of July, Napoleon had advanced 250 miles into Russia, much further than he'd planned. And the long marches in extreme summer heat continued to take a heavy toll on his men. Without fighting a major battle, the army had already suffered 20% casualties, from exhaustion and illness, particularly typhus and dysentery. The army had entered Russia with 250,000 horses, but they were now dying at a rate of 1,000 every day, from exhaustion and lack of fodder. It wasn't just cavalry horses that were dying, but the very horses that were supposed to haul the army's transport wagons, making a bad situation worse. This crisis in horsepower came just as the French light cavalry, Napoleon's eyes and ears, met their match in Russia's Cossacks. Cossacks, self-reliant, proud, ruthless, and superb horsemen, didn't play by the same rules as other European cavalry. Every day they shadowed Napoleon's army, swooping in whenever they saw an easy target, but melting away into the forests if they were attacked by a stronger force. Cossacks, as well as Russian partisans, made hit-and-run attacks on French supply lines and depots, forcing Napoleon to divert thousands of troops to their defense. Alongside Russian regular light cavalry, they also prevented French patrols from carrying out reconnaissance, which meant that Napoleon often lacked good information about roads or the enemy's whereabouts. Napoleon stayed 16 days at Vitebsk, resting his troops and considering his options. Among his many mounting concerns was the security of his long, exposed flanks. But at Vitebsk, he received news that Schwarzenberg had defeated the Russians at Borodino. A week later at Polotsk, a French Bavarian force fought Wittgenstein's Russian First Corps to a standstill. Napoleon's flanks were secure, for now. Although his main force had been reduced to less than half its original strength, Napoleon decided to push on to Smolensk and try to force the Russians into a decisive battle for the city. Barclay was indeed under pressure to give battle from fellow commander Prince Bagration and Emperor Alexander in St. Petersburg. The army's morale and Russia's honor required it, they told him. With the First and Second Russian armies finally linking up near Smolensk, Barclay decided to attack Napoleon's army, which he believed was concentrated around Rudnya. The offensive was led by General Platov's Cossacks, who surprised a French cavalry division at Inkovo. But alarmed by false reports that Eugene's Fourth Corps was outflanking him to the north, Barclay called off the attack. Napoleon, reassured that Barclay's offensive posed no real threat, began a grand outflanking move to the south to take Smolensk and cut off the Russian retreat. The so-called Smolensk maneuver was Napoleon at his best, using Murat's cavalry to screen his movements and keep Barclay in the dark. The Emperor reached the Dnieper on the evening of the 13th of August. His engineers quickly threw up 4 pontoon bridges, and by dawn the next day, his army was across. Marshal Davout led a second column across the river at Orsha. But a single Russian division, the 27th, fought a heroic fighting retreat from Krasny, delaying the French advance and buying time for Bagration to reinforce the Smolensk garrison. The chance for a surprise assault on the city was lost. And as the Russian army began to pull back, Napoleon displayed an uncharacteristic lack of urgency, even halting the army for a parade to mark his 43rd birthday. When the main attack on Smolensk began 2 days later, Napoleon opted for a frontal assault. 150 French guns battered the city as 3 French corps attacked its medieval fortifications. The Russians resisted bravely, but Barclay, fearing encirclement, ordered another retreat. With Smolensk in flames, the Russians began to pull out. Just as the French fought their way into the city, to scenes of utter devastation. Bagration's Second Army withdrew first. As Barclay's army followed, its rearguard was caught by Ney's Third Corps at Valutino. General Junot, commanding the Westphalian Eighth Corps, had orders to cut off Barclay's retreat. But having crossed the river, he did nothing, and the opportunity was lost. A furious Napoleon swore that Junot would never now win his marshal's baton. The Battle of Smolensk cost both sides around 10,000 casualties, and destroyed one of Russia's most historic and holy cities, but settled nothing. After the missed chance to defeat the Russians at Smolensk, Napoleon paused once more to consider his options. His men were weary and far from home, and it was already late in the campaigning season. He considered sitting out the Russian winter at Smolensk and resuming the campaign in 1813. But now he was just 230 miles from Moscow. A century earlier, Peter the Great had moved Russia's capital to St. Petersburg, but Moscow remained its historic and spiritual heart, a prize for which the Russians had to fight. Napoleon, always a gambler, decided to push on. The Russians faced their own dilemma. Emperor Alexander had experienced a kind of religious epiphany that summer and rallied the Russian people to the country's defense, describing the war with Napoleon as a war to save Holy Mother Russia from the Antichrist. For months, the emperor had received conflicting advice to stand and fight or retreat. Now he decided change was needed. The cautious General Barclay kept his job, but the emperor summoned General Mikhail Kutuzov to take overall command of Russia's armies. Kutuzov had been beaten by Napoleon at Austerlitz 7 years before, but he'd since won several victories against the Ottoman Empire and was a true Russian, loved by the troops. Although Kutuzov agreed with Barclay's strategy of delay, he saw that constant retreats were destroying the soldiers' and the nation's morale. If Moscow was given up without a battle, the fallout could be disastrous. And so, 70 miles west of the city, near the village of Borodino, the Russian army prepared to make a stand. Europe was about to witness the bloodiest day's fighting of the Napoleonic Wars. September 1812. 10 weeks had passed since Napoleon invaded Russia with more than 500,000 men. The French Emperor wanted a quick victory over the Russians, one that would force Emperor Alexander to make peace and agree to French terms. But at Vitebsk, and then Smolensk, the outnumbered Russian army had narrowly escaped his clutches. The holy city of Smolensk had been virtually destroyed. Napoleon had advanced deep into Russia, and months of marching had left his army decimated by disease and exhaustion. It was now half its original strength, and summer was nearly over. But finally, 70 miles west of Moscow, near the village of Borodino, the Russians had turned to offer battle. Napoleon would have a chance to win the decisive victory that he believed would end the war. Russian army, commanded by the 67-year-old one-eyed veteran General Kutuzov, occupied a defensive position across the two main roads leading from Smolensk to Moscow. General Barclay de Tolly's First Army was on the right, its front protected by the Kalatsha River, steep-banked but shallow and easily forded. Prince Bagration's Second Army was on the left, a more open position but reinforced by major earthworks, the Great Redoubt, and what the French nicknamed, for their shape, the Flèche, the arrows. Another forward redoubt at Borodino was expected to delay the enemy's advance. Historians still dispute the size of the Russian army, but it's likely Kutuzov had around 121,000 men and 680 guns at Borodino. On the 5th of September, Napoleon's army began to arrive from the west, around 130,000 men and 585 guns. Napoleon quickly saw that the Borodino redoubt would have to be taken before he could deploy his army, and ordered an immediate assault. The attack was led by Compan's 5th Division of the 1st Corps, supported by the Polish 5th Corps to the south. In several hours of heavy fighting, the redoubt changed hands more than once. But late that evening, the Russians finally withdrew to their main line, and the redoubt fell to the French. Its capture had cost them an estimated 4,000 casualties, while the Russians lost around 6,000 men. Napoleon noted how few prisoners were taken, a worrying sign of the enemy's unbroken resolve. Both sides spent the next day preparing for battle. Marshal Davout, commanding French First Corps and widely considered Napoleon's most able subordinate, appealed to the Emperor to use his corps to make a wide, outflanking attack to the south. But Napoleon dismissed the idea as too risky, and instead began preparing for a massive frontal assault on the Russian defences. Shortly after dawn on the 7th of September, Orthodox priests paraded one of Russia's holiest icons, Our Lady of Smolensk, before the Russian army. It was a stirring sight for many devout Russian soldiers, thousands of whom would not live to see dusk. The battle began at 6 a.m. as French batteries opened a deafening cannonade against the Russian defences. Eugene's 4th Corps advanced on Borodino village, lightly held by Jaegers of the Russian Imperial Guard. After clearing the village, his infantry crossed the Kalatsha and advanced towards the Great Redoubt, but were driven back with heavy losses. The Russians burned the bridge across the river, but did not launch a counterattack, and Eugene was able to move cannon into the village to put flanking fire on the Great Redoubt. In the centre, Davout's 1st Corps began its advance against the Flèche, coming under heavy fire. While on the right, the Polish 5th Corps, ordered to take Utitsa, got held up in the woods and ravines. Their slow advance allowed Tushkov's 3rd Corps to send a division north to reinforce the Flèche defences. Kutuzov, at his headquarters in Gorky, took little part in the battle, leaving tactical decisions to his subordinates. Barclay and Bagration had spent most of the summer arguing furiously over strategy, but in the hour of crisis, they put their differences aside. They could see the main French attack was falling on the Russian centre and left. So Barclay ordered General Bagavout's 2nd Corps south to reinforce Bagration. Fighting around the Flèche intensified as the French captured one of the earthworks, only to be driven out by a Russian counterattack. Davout himself was injured in the fighting as he fell from his dying horse, but he refused to leave the field. When Russian cavalry counterattacked, Marshal Murat himself led the French cavalry forward to meet them. Ney's Third Corps now joined the attack on the Fleches. A charge by Russian cuirassiers forced Murat to take shelter in a square of Württemberg infantry. Murat, with his flamboyant dress and reckless courage, had now even made a name for himself among the Russians. The Cossacks in particular saw him as a kindred spirit, and were eager to capture him alive if they could. To the south, Polish troops now took Utitsa, which the Russians set ablaze before withdrawing. But General Bagavout's reinforcements arrived just in time to shore up the Russian flank. Around 10 AM, Eugène launched another attack on the Great Redoubt. It was briefly captured by Morand's 1st Division, before his men were thrown out by a ferocious Russian counter.